started the discussion in a way. One point that I'd like to hear comments on and reactions to is Ellen Keller makes this model that they have developed and used and improved and adapted look so easy to do. They run with it, they roll it. There are some constraints that were nicely expressed by Stella, but are we feeling that really adding all of those things, like our last experiment, for me, the last experiment of adding the water and sanitation and adding the LNS was really a proof of concept. Does it work? When you actually provide more of the things that a child needs to grow, do you get a better result? And we've shown that, yeah, we get a better result. We get an impact on stunting that we've never gotten before. But from an implementation perspective and from a programmatic perspective, do people feel that this is doable, that others who may have less experience with this kind of model might be able to have programs that are really quite heavy to carry with all of the different components? So that's one point. There's many others that were raised in the discussion, but I think if anyone has opinions, and even the speakers, about this overloading, possible overloading of programs, and what do we do about it, and linking to the point about adolescent girls, from my perspective and my review of the literature and my understanding of the evidence that we have, I certainly feel that agriculture could also be a delivery platform for interventions targeted to adolescent girls, especially those who are not in school. And would that be, yet again, too much to ask to tag that along? And so this is one topic, but I don't want to bias you. Feel free to ask your own questions. So the floor is open. I think there must be a microphone. Yes, there's a microphone. Emmy. Oh, yes, sorry, I forgot to invite you. Good that you invite yourselves.
Emmy Simmons, I'm actually associated with A4NH. And I think that, Marie, your comments led up to the question that was sort of laying in my brain when Victoria was talking was, is HKI now prepared to take this to the cost effectiveness level and to start making decisions as to, you know, the costs of the extra staff, the cost of the LNS, the extra investment, presumably some kind of incentives in creating latrines and that sort of thing. Have you, apart from the study here, actually sort of carried this information into the implementation domain?
Thanks, Emmy. It's nice to see you again. I think the last time was somewhere in Taiwan. Yes, I mean, that's a really great question, and we would love to, and that would be going forward in the future, because to do that, we need to get support to invest more in that research to take it forward. So yes, I mean, that's important, especially in terms of the idea of scaling up and what components are scalable. And, you know, as I say that, one has to be very aware, and I'm sure we all are aware here, that it really depends on the context of the country. Scale up in a place like the Sahel, when there's no water, would be quite different from scaling up in parts of Nepal. So, of course, the local context is very, very important. So we have not been able to undertake the cost effectiveness as of yet. We would dearly love to do it, right, Marie?
Yes, we would.
We would, indeed. And so I'm very happy that you brought that very germane question to the floor.
And the scale up.
Yes, absolutely.
Can I add something?
Yes, sure, of course.
I agree with you that cost effectiveness is really important for this kind of platform. But one of the things it's very difficult about doing it is, what are the effects, right? One of the arguments we have for these kind of big projects is that you don't impact only nutrition, but you have other effects in terms of income generation, women's empowerment, perhaps environmental benefits. And one of the challenges with cost effectiveness for such a broad project is, how do you measure and how do you account for all of those, and how do you deal with additionality and attribution? So I think it's very important, but yeah, it's not easy.
And we have unsuccessfully put the economists in this institute to the task of telling us how to do this, because it is talking about multiple outcomes and looking at cost effectiveness and making sense of the unit here. What is effectiveness? It's not just one outcome, and I think even within nutrition, it's not just stunting, it's all the other things as well. So we certainly have a big challenge here, and there is no progress with the economists on that. Rolf?
Well, have the economists thought about some sort of a multi-benefit index?
Yeah.
Not so much effectiveness, but looking at trying to value the multiple kinds of benefits. Of course, then the question also deals with the time horizon. So it would require, for example, going back to some of these communities, because they potentially continue to generate benefits, potentially, to the communities. And so how does one think about that? Because the equation can be, if it's focused on a particular effect, can show a rather costly intervention. But when one looks at the potential multiple benefits and a bit of a longer-term horizon, that equation can change dramatically.
Good points. More questions? Yes. There's two there. Yeah. Oh.
All right, my name is Gwyneth Cotes. I'm from Spring. I was really glad that you talked a lot about gender on this end of the panel, and I'm a big fan of HKI's work that they've been doing on tackling gender norms. But then I was struck by the image of all women, working around a garden in a home garden, which kind of reinforces a view that that is women's work. And traditionally, when you are clustering women all into one profession, the end result isn't empowerment. It's that that profession gets devalued and marginalized. So, this is something that I've really struggled with in our own work is, how do you do programming, particularly ag programming, that's targeting women without reinforcing gender divisions of work and labor and reinforcing those norms?
We'll take another one, and then you can decide who wants to answer that.
Hi, this is Fred Grant from HKI, and I just wanted to touch on the question that you raised, Marie, around scale. And I think in a impact evaluation program, a research program, we need to ensure that every beneficiary, every household has every intervention. In the real world, when we're looking at scale 2, we can look at where are the areas that need specific interventions, when, at what time. And so there may need to be focus on nutrition SPCC in farmer cooperatives. In one area, there may need to be a focus on strengthening agronomic support through extension services. In another, there may need to be policy improvement, making agriculture policies more nutrition sensitive at the enabling environment level. And I think one way to really achieve scale is to really target those interventions that are needed among different groups geographically and temporarily as well, rather than just feeling that everything needs to be provided to everybody all the time.
Thank you. Good point. Other questions? Yes.
Hi, my name's Heather Danton. I'm also with the Spring Project and JSI. So my question actually adds on to Fred's a little bit because while we were talking about the program impact pathways, I was wondering, you didn't actually have income as a part of what was going on with that, but I was wondering if you collected data on income, especially in a setting where you don't have water. And so to have that year-round access component, I was just wondering what you found with that. And it also got me thinking very much about what Fred was saying, that doing that analysis up front, and how do you design a project up front that's sort of saying like, okay, we know that year-round agriculture is probably not going to be the answer necessarily to year-round dietary diversity in terms of what's being produced. So we do have to look at the income pathway. So I do think that that's probably, I don't know how we then add that in. I don't feel like I want to layer more on top of the model, but I think maybe looking at the data collection and the design of what gets emphasized might be a sort of a next interesting question.
Okay, so I think those are Victoria questions.
In terms of the gender approach, I'm going to also ask actually Stella to speak about that, and perhaps our colleagues from ICRW who's in the room today, because certainly the intention is to bring in not just the men but the community overall, so that we don't fall into the trap, Gwyneth, as you so rightly stated. And that is a part of the fabric of our approach to gender transformational gender training in these projects, which we call the Nurturing Connection training materials, and they're adapted very much to the different countries or contexts that they're used in, but men are very much part and parcel. So I don't know, Stella, if you want to jump in, add to that, or Aslan, in terms of being on the ground and what happened in the countries where change was.
Sure, I can speak a bit to that. I think it's a really important point. It didn't come through as much in the Burkina Faso work, but in Côte d'Ivoire and Senegal, where we had this gender transformative curriculum, a lot of what we were focused on, we were working with men. We were working with community leaders, and the goal was to have kind of everybody involved in this. And one thing we saw is that gardens where the husband was also engaged and was able to help really had improved productivity and improved sustainability. Another thing we saw within those areas was one of the problems, particularly with poultry production, is that when it's originally promoted to women, it's women's thing for a little while, and then it gets maybe a bit more productive and a bit more interesting, and gradually men kind of start to take over, and there's a bit of capture of the benefits of that. And by explicitly addressing gender norms through the gender transformative curriculum and really talking about that outright, we were able to mitigate some of that in the countries where that was taking place. So I think by having explicit programming, don't assume that this is going to happen. People are going to change gender norms as a result of agricultural activities, but really address it head on and talk about these ownership issues. And I think that can help mitigate some of the siloing of gender into different genders in that way. I think another thing that's crucial that we didn't do that much within change, a little bit in Côte d'Ivoire, but not within other areas, women also need to be pulled into the high value agriculture too. This isn't just about gardening. We need to get women producing more cash crops. We need to get more into the market value chain and really getting the benefits of that, not just contributing their labor for free on plots that are owned and overseen by men. So that was a bit beyond the scope of Change Burkina Faso, but I think it's an important direction as we look into the future and, again, try to have a more feminist development approach.
Diana, yeah.
I also wanted to just follow up on the comment on gender. In the Change Burkina Faso evaluation, this wasn't randomized across groups. Everyone received the same types of intervention, so it wasn't something we looked at in terms of impact. But in the first evaluation of the HFP program, we had some additional funding from the Gates Foundation through the GAP project, and we spent a lot of time looking at this question of gender and roles in agriculture and changes in ownership of assets and all kinds of things and social norms around gender. And in this context, actually, women's role in agriculture, even around the home gardening plot, wasn't actually seen as something women were able to do originally. So we interviewed a lot of men, and some of the comments that we got from the husbands of the beneficiaries were that they were seeing through this program how women can do this. They can be responsible for these types of activities, and they were supportive of women's role in income generation and making decisions. And we saw a lot of positive trends and increases in women's participating purchasing decisions and getting some support from their husbands for making these kinds of decisions. And so I think we also need to be careful about just assuming that home gardening, that there is this kind of division everywhere. That in this case in Burkina, I think the agriculture activities do tend to be for men anyway, and so even kind of getting the women to take ownership of these activities and be able to control the income was something new in these communities. And so it was something that was positive and not just kind of reinforcing gender norms, at least in the first evaluation where this was randomized between groups.
Talking about, yeah. Okay.
I just wanted
I'll go back.
Stella's point on nurturing connections curriculum and what we were intending to achieve through that approach, which involved men and the communities, was also sort of links to sort of the burdening the individuals and the beneficiaries with multiple expectations of behavior change at once, was looking at the productive sphere and division of labor and norms around, economic work, but also the care work of expecting, somebody sort of breastfeeding and cooking and so forth. I think that's one of the pathways of impact. It's also getting more attention, the time poverty that women already face and all these expectations that come with it. So changing norms around care work, around lifting the unpaid care work that women have to shoulder along with the other roles they have. So that was one of the other areas that we tried to work around, involving men and involving communities.
Okay, so yeah.
I just wanted to follow up on your comment about sort of isolating women on the homestead, and I think, and I'd be interested to hear what HKI has to say about this. But I think there are times when the market doesn't work very well, where household gardening is a really important part of getting improving the supply of nutritious foods. But there are also places where the market works really well, and it makes sense to pursue the economic pathway, like you were saying, I think, Heather. And we've really been pushing to get women involved throughout the value chain in a lot of these small and medium enterprises that a lot of them are processing safe, nutritious foods that are then reliable year-round. And our administrator was just in India at the Global Entrepreneurship Summit, really, and launched one of our initiatives to get women involved in food processing of safe and nutritious food. So I think that's what you were getting at, and we would agree that there's time for investment in the household garden and time for investment in alternative pathways. And would you all agree? Yeah.
Yes, in terms of the next evolution of the HFP program and sort of moving forward, one of the areas that's a high priority is that value add in terms of sort of the produce and what happens to it, and whether it's food processing or whatever, but just sort of to take it beyond sort of the nutritional outcomes and the health outcomes. And a new project of ours in Myanmar will start to look at sort of livelihood and start to push that forward on that. And we'd love to actually, in certain countries, find the right partners at that other end that we can partner with to create the demand for the products that are being produced. So it's not just supply. So it involves sort of a good fit at the country level, but it's something that we would like to do because we think we can keep moving it forward down that train.
Yes.
Just a very brief addition on the importance of what we measure and the fact that to be gender transformative, it's important to measure access to the labor market or access to income generation, but that's just one piece of it. And so you need to get into those other issues and what the gender narrative would be. And I think there are some good examples of measuring those sort of more demand side things or softer issues around empowerment. In fact, there are some good examples in this room, but it has to go beyond just the things that are easy for us to measure. And I think donors actually have a responsibility there to ask for reporting on those kinds of things, not just the ones that are easy to explain to our political leadership, for example, but the stuff that's a little harder to get at, but that's where you really find the change. Thanks.
And that's a good point, and that's a good time to put a little plug for our Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index, but all the other indices that are in preparation and our refinements of all of this exactly for that purpose. Again, collecting all of the information for just the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index is very time consuming. There are efforts to simplify the index and have an index more specific to value chain and one more specific to nutrition. So before getting simpler, I think things might get a little more complicated, but I think there's a lot of people in this room working exactly on that. And I think it really is helping what you measure gets much more visibility because you can talk about it, you can identify the specific dimensions that are particularly weak in certain areas. And I know that the WEA has been used specifically for designing programs. Say in Bangladesh, for example, these are the domains where we really need to improve things. Let's do this, let's do that. So the power of data is always something that we need to remember. We have just a few more minutes before we get to the concluding remarks by Rolf, but there was the question of income that I think would be good to hear what information we have on income generated from.
Yeah. So we do collect income data, and we did in the first evaluation of the EHFP program when we compared it to control group. And we actually did not find any impact on income. And part of that is because cash is very low. I mean, the income overall over the course of the years is very low. And so being able to detect, a difference in income in this context is very, very difficult. But we did some other analyses to try to look at, how things may have changed, in terms of dietary diversity or consumption of micronutrient-rich foods. And what we saw was that, it basically looks like the program is not working so much through an income pathway, but more through the addition of the behavior change communication and the availability of the nutrient-rich foods in the community. So whether that's through trading or own consumption or whatnot, that it is shifting what people are doing with their income. So there's increases in animal source food consumption and micronutrient-rich fruits and vegetables, but not an actual income effect, which we did actually measure. And we have the data for the Change Project as well. But since this wasn't a randomized part of the program, the agriculture program was the same across the different groups. It hasn't been one of our high priority topics to analyze, but we do have the data, and will be analyzed eventually.